So as many of us have made resolutions, I wanted to chit-chat about a little bit on how we actually go about breaking down a goal into what ends up to be a daily habit. And so we'll just dive right in. A little bit of what I want to cover is we're going to go through a habit check. I'm going to ask a few questions, and you don't have to give me answers. That's okay. I want to talk about, are we actually getting enough of the good stuff, as well as the basic foundations of recommendations for what we look for throughout your lifestyle, as well as how do you match up to those recommendations. And if you're not there, welcome to being an adult. That's totally fine. And I'm going to sort of run you through an example of how we do that in our coaching program. So, and then I'm going to actually run you through that example and get into some questions and answers. So, question number one is, are your habits working for you, or are they working against you? On a daily basis, as many of you can probably recall, there's a lot of decisions that you make throughout a day, subconscious or conscious, and a lot of this comes down into your behavior on a daily basis. And so trying to get your habits in a place where you don't have to think as often to make the right decisions, and you can actually make progress without thinking as much or as hard about it. So keep this in the back of your head as you're going through, or as we're going through the rest of this, because it'll make sense a little bit later. I like to ask the question, are you doing enough, or is what you're doing right now enough? So you could be doing all of the right things, and I'll talk about the basis or the basics of those, but you could be doing all of the right things on paper. However, it could be that you're not actually doing enough. And so we're going to talk a bit about that. Up here are some of the general recommendations that if you are getting this on paper and you're ticking those boxes of getting enough sleep, getting the right nutrition, as well as the appropriate amounts for your body, and that's relative and will differ based on individuals. But on top of that, how's your training? So pretty much any governing body related to exercise and activity recommends approximately 250 minutes a week, which is just around that 3.5 hour mark, I believe, if my math is right. Don't quote me on it, though. Am I right? 4 hours, yeah. 4 hours and change. So that breaks down into two days at the very minimum of resistance training. We like to add a third one because there's a lot of benefit that's there, as well as at least 2 days of aerobic activity. So that can count as light stretching, active recovery, cycling, pedaling, walking, gardening, that sort of stuff. Whereas the other 2 days are strict resistance training, where you're pushing a load or you're straining your muscular system in some capacity. And so if we're not there, and this is where a lot of people find themselves, they've either got 2 out of 3 or 1.5 out of 3. They're close, but they're not quite there. This is where we focus on for most people most often. And then depending where their skill level and where they're at, then we can build from there. So how do you get there? That's kind of the question that a lot of people have is, first, if they don't know what those recommendations are, we want to make sure that those are known so that they have something to base against. They have a benchmark. But how do you get there? And so what I'm going to basically boil it down for you is, whatever your goal is, we want to reverse engineer that from the overarching thing. Let's say you want to lose weight, you want to gain muscle, you want to sleep better, if you're me. Skills build into reaching that goal, and then on top of that, habits then build into those skills. So we look at it first as goals, skills, habits, and we basically build it out from the habits back up to the goal. So sort of a twofold there. So let's actually go into an example that is fairly common. I apologize, it's fairly small, but the overarching goal there is to lose body fat. I left a number out because it's relative. What's that? Okay. She's got it. So we have an example on these pages that will make it easier to read. But how we break this down, again, there's the overarching goal of wanting to lose body fat, fairly common. What are the skills necessary in order to reach that goal of reducing your body fat? Number one that we focus on a lot of times is getting used to or increasing your awareness around your hunger cues. So when you're actually hungry, when you're not, are you eating too much, too fast? Whatever the case may be, we're focusing on the first practice here of eating slowly. That way, your brain and your digestive system actually communicate more effectively throughout the time of your meal. So if you've eaten too much too fast, you end up most often bloated, unhappy, feeling heavy, and not so happy. What we do when we eat slowly, we allow the communication between the two systems to actually catch up with one another and meet on common ground. Like, we've either had just enough food or not enough food, please bring more, or we've had way too much, please stop. So eating slowly is the first one that we start with in order to help that awareness skill. Number two is to eat to satisfaction. We use the number 80% because it's a good number, it's a nice round number, but it also allows for, if your goal being to lose body fat, it allows for a calorie deficit, which as you're trying to lose weight, that's what we're aiming for. But again, it feeds into, no pun intended, that was awful, but it actually works really well with the eating slowly component because you actually get a sense for when you're actually satiated or satisfied versus overfull and stuffed. On the next part, planning healthy meals. It's probably where I spend a good 30% of conversations around nutrition is planning and preparation of food. So preparing a menu for when you go grocery shopping and then having a list of what you need for your menu and then getting those groceries and then preparing them. On top of that, the next part, which is definitely more challenging, is actually recording what you're eating. And if you're really science nerdy like I am, you can compare to the menu and how close you got. Because sometimes you'll find those extra snacks that add up in there. Now, going into actual food recommendations is to get whole foods as consistently and as often as possible, which is important for a multitude of reasons, but getting nutrient-dense food is always better than processed food, as we know. But on top of that, especially, again, focusing on the goal of losing body fat, our fifth practice there is to eat lean protein, which has a plethora of benefits, but is huge for recovery, as we know as we're training. Getting more protein in to help fuel that recovery so that you can train again, you can repeat that stimulus in order to progress towards your goal. So very, very important. Again, going further into eating 5 or more servings of produce a day is important. Again, getting nutrient-dense foods is of the utmost importance. The next two is building on top of that of just making smarter carb choices and eating healthier fats, which those two, again, in and of itself is quite challenging for many people, and where a lot of the fallacies of how diets work and high fat, low fat, or high protein, low carb, all sorts of different stuff, it's usually manipulating those two variables. And a lot of people still happen to be in the low fat phase. I'm not going to go in there. That's open for another conversation. So that's just one example, again, of just focusing on losing body fat. And I have another one for improving fitness, which well, we're in a gym. That is typically a big goal for many, many people. But I broke this one down a little bit, probably oversimplistically, but as you can hopefully see, some of the skills that you need are showing up, do the work, recover, and mindset associated with your training. Basically going from your habits back into building up that skill, which then leads to the goal. So you can kind of see how the reverse engineering of this whole process then builds back up to actually reach the goal, as opposed to making a SMART goal, which is still valuable, but I find that this process just makes it way easier and actually provides you a framework for time, and you can estimate your time on how long this would take. What we use per block here is about 2 weeks to focus on each habit. Choosing better foods, time productivity, sleeping better, anything. You can break it down. It doesn't necessarily need to be this extensive. You may only get to here, and that's totally fine. You've got 4 solid things that you can practice over the next 8 weeks and see some results, hopefully. So I hope that clarifies some things and makes it a little bit easier and breaks it down too, because a lot of people around this time, they just make their resolution and they sort of hope for the best and aim for it haphazardly, whereas I like to have something a little bit more structured and systematized so that it's going to help you longer term, which is always better. So that's all that I have for you guys. So thanks for sitting through that. And I'll take any questions related to this or completely out of left field. I'll take them all. So hit me with what you got.
So, 1,000 conversations we've had about sleep and routine, and as we get older, we apparently don't need as much sleep.
Correct.
So how do we work with that?
In what way?
There's quite a variation between like my sleep of 4 hours to 9 hours, just depending on the day.
Right.
So scientifically, is it okay that at the end of the week it all merges up? Or obviously when you don't get enough sleep one night, it's impactful to the next day. Right?
Of course, yeah. From the way that I understand it, if you want to put a number to it, that's great to track. Yeah. But yeah, if you have sporadic sleep where it's 4 hours and then 9 hours, like there is an element of catching up. It's when the spillover into the next day compounds into the following day and the following day where it's not helping. But if you're able to compensate for it in a short order, that's the ideal situation under the circumstances. Ideally, of course, it would be pretty consistent, but real life doesn't always allow that to happen. Yeah, it's...
Warm milk at night. I know Ryan and I talked about melatonin before, I think. Right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
you know.
Yep, sleep supplements that work well with you are key. Magnesium in the right form, whether it be transdermal, so spray.
We got a magnesium spray from Amazon because we had read it in like a sleep book.
Yeah.
And I did find that it was helpful to get to sleep.
Yeah.
But in terms of length or depth of sleep, that was up to me. But I did go to sleep quicker.
Okay, that's interesting.
One of the things I would take note of though is when you're looking for a supplement that's going on your skin, test to have a couple.
Okay.
So the one that we got is okay for me to put on the bottom of my feet because it's thick skin. But if I put it on my arm or my chest, like it says on the bottle, I get itchy.
Oh,
and it's
okay.
really irritating.
Right.
It does say that with continued use that'll go away. So I'm just not willing to go through it.
Right.
So I put it on my feet
Interesting.
and then it's fine.
Okay.
So there's different concentrations. There are pills, like we've tried magnesium pills. I didn't find that they did anything. So I bought the oil and it was
Interesting, okay.
Certain forms of magnesium are better too. Like stay clear of the citrate and steer clear of like magnesium
Yeah,
oxide.
the citrate.
The two of those are going to move through your system quickly.
Right, okay.
Whereas like a bisglycinate, especially, that's a big one right now, and that's really nice because it doesn't upset your stomach.
Yeah.
It goes a little slower, and then
Okay.
Yeah.
you're not screwing over your digestive system
Right.
quite the same way.
My naturopath had suggested for me to take a melatonin at time, sustain.
The time release ones? Yeah.
She
tried
called it
melatonin,
sustain
but-
release, but I got that one from the natural food store, but I generally don't get the time release one.
Time release is a decent compound.
And she also said for me to take it an hour before bed,
Right.
but she also said no screen, no
Yes,
this,
of
no
course.
that,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which isn't something that I always do. I find that watching TV before I go to bed is actually relaxing me because I don't tend to sit down too much.
Right, okay, yeah.
But that's what the suggestions that she made.
Yeah, I've tried the melatonin without any success, but I might try that. Because my issue is not typically staying asleep as they're getting there.
The
so,
getting, yeah, for me
yeah,
too,
yeah,
it was a bit of a
interesting.
struggle, but
Yeah.
it would take me 2 to 3 hours some
Right.
nights to go to sleep.
Yeah,
So it was hard. The other thing I found was lavender essential oil if I drop some on my pillow.
Oh, okay.
And either flip my pillow upside down or if you put the drops an hour before you go to bed, because right away it's so strong.
Oh,
like,
right,
you can
yeah.
see it.
Okay.
So if you do it right away, I just put my pillow upside down and then it's like this, just a little bit of lavender actually, or it helped a lot too.
Right.
And it also helped with dreams.
Oh.
Sometimes if I'm stressed, I'll have bad dreams
Yeah.
and dreams would go away.
oh, interesting.
I even have like a little roller that I use for headaches.
Yeah.
I put it right on my temples and on the back of my neck.
Yeah.
And it's peppermint and lavender.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sort of depends on where the issue is, like you said, if it's falling asleep or staying asleep.
Right.
And yeah, you can supplement usually to help you fall asleep, but staying asleep is usually the trickier bit that people struggle with, and that's practice, as silly as it sounds.
Yeah, practice will do more than I usually do.
Yeah, and more often than not, it's usually for like the 3 hours before bedtime versus like the 15 minutes, like brush teeth, wash face, crawl into bed. Like it's usually what's happening in the 3 to 5 hours before bedtime that's actually going to impact the quality and duration of your sleep as well.